first biography of Jimmy Breslin. And I guess, Rich, the obvious question would be why Breslin, but to start a little more focused, I'm curious. I know you knew him personally, but were you a reader first?
Yeah, I was a reader of all the newspapers. My parents had a candy store, and I used to bundle the papers every night, especially the Sunday papers. And I would read Jimmy's column, I would read Pete's column when he was in the Post for a while. And that's when I became a reader of Jimmy. And I became a clerk in Cotton Boy at the Daily News, and that's when I got to meet him in person. He had been there 6 months when I got there. He's on Sam, we just ended when I got to the Daily News for the first time.
And it seems like I know that his words translate well on the page. You get some glimpse of it on video, but as you admirably keep yourself out of the book for the most part. But it seems that there was something about being in his presence just larger than life, that he was really a wild character that you capture perfectly in the opening of the book.
Yeah, I mean, James is here, and he can tell you his father was larger than life, and that you had to walk on eggshells when you were in the house and he was writing. Silence was demanded in his home. In the office, he screamed, he bellowed, he thundered, he never had any money, he demanded coffee. Basically, as Dick Oliver, who was his editor, said, he was a miserable human being to be around until he handed in his work. And then what you got was a joy to read.
It seems as though he was a workaholic, where he would have had a career that would be, he would have a career that'd be enviable if all that he did was work for the newspaper or write books. But he did those, and even his literary friendships crossed paths when he even ran for office with Norman Mailer, which I feel like in a bookstore we need to touch on some of his big literary hits.
It was quite a moment in time, 1969, when Jimmy Breslin and Norman Mailer decided they would run for mayor and city council president, and they drafted Gloria Steinem to be the press secretary. She chose to stay behind the scenes because these two egomaniacs took up all the air in the room. Mailer wrote these long, florid speeches, like his books, and Jimmy wrote these very terse, simple speeches. One of his speeches was at the police academy, and he said, I checked, I made sure all the chairs had been bolted to the floor before I came in, and I didn't bring a lawyer with me. Mailer gave him a long speech about law enforcement, policing, and one day Jimmy realized this guy was serious. He actually wanted to run for mayor. And then Steiner and Breslin were like, that wasn't the point here. The point here was to make a point and go home. And they lost, they got like 17% of the total vote, or maybe less. But they were very, very different kinds of writers and different kinds of people. Both of them had larger than life egos, of course. So that was an interesting dynamic between the two of them.
Breslin can now be lumped in with the school of writers called New Journalism, with Mailer, then also Tom Wolfe, who dressed like an aristocrat to be an alien and keep himself different from the people he covered. Whereas Breslin seems far less self-conscious and natural in the way he approached his writing. Did he ever try and put a sheen on it, or was he just who he was and that's how it was going to come out?
No, I mean, what you saw, that is the sheen on it. He's a writer, and the way he wrote was exactly what he wanted you to see. Tom Wolfe and he lived in one universe when they were young. In 1963, they sat a few yards from each other at the Herald Tribune. And Tom Wolfe only had that white suit because he only had enough money for one suit. And he came from the South, and so he said, well, I've got to have a suit for work. A white suit is what they wear where I come from. So he bought a white suit. And that became the start of Tom Wolfe. The new journalism, Tom Wolfe and Breslin both said, was the old journalism. Tom Wolfe said, the garbage barge of history is filled with movements that begin with the word new. And he really didn't like the phrase, but so we're stuck with it. Jimmy said the only thing new about what they did was everybody forgot how to tell stories. Then when they talked a little about it, the universes pulled apart. Wolfe wrote every book with the goal of there being one word in the book that nobody who read the book would know without looking it up. And Jimmy wrote with the goal of there being no commas in a sentence, if at all possible. Two very different kinds of writers, gifted.
When you talk about the stories, I know that you spoke to an incredible number of people for this book, and I wonder if you could share who some of those people were and maybe some of the most surprising stories you heard.
What's most amazing is the stories keep coming in. You know, today I got an email from a guy that worked as an assistant city editor at the World Journal Tribune, which existed for about 9 months in between newspapers folding. And he was tasked with taking Jimmy's phone calls. And he was also tasked with, when Jimmy got drunk and couldn't come to work, putting a notice in the paper saying, Jimmy Breslin says he's sick. And he says the column will be back when he feels better. And that story came in today. So you meet all kinds of people in the course of doing this book. I got to know James and Kevin Breslin very well. But we also got to interview in his 92nd year of his life, Jimmy's first editor. When Jimmy was 18, he wrote a story about how putting television in bars changed the nature of conversation. He was a clerk, and the editor of the Ted Gerstein, who I work with, Ted found the editor, and no one had ever talked to him about Jimmy. So, and he had an amazing story to tell. It was completely different than Jimmy's version of how he got fired. He basically said Jimmy made up his version, and here's what actually happened. But if you ask Jimmy, he would say, no, that's not true. This is what happened. I know what happened. I said it happened. So we met an amazing range of people, including people who really did not like Jimmy Breslin. In fact, there's one person who wouldn't even let me acknowledge that he helped. He didn't even want an acknowledgement in the book. He said he wanted no part of anything. Jimmy didn't exist for him anymore as far as he was concerned. I was like, well, that's pretty cold. He said, no, it's not. I don't even know who he is anymore. We're done. Gay Talese wrote a nice letter explaining very carefully, as you know, why he would not speak ill of the dead. Therefore, he had nothing good to say about Jimmy, so he had nothing he could tell me. Though he liked a lot of Jimmy's friends. And in fact, when Kevin Breslin got married, Gay Talese gave up his hotel room so that Kevin would have a honeymoon suite. So he didn't hold it against anybody else, just Jimmy for 50 some odd years.
Now, when you went about writing this book, you did all the research, you conducted all the interviews, but was there a voice in your head that this is, at the same time, I would say, a popular biography? You have a lively voice in how it's approached, and was that partly just your own style, or was that also a tribute? Is this the book that Jimmy might have hoped would come of his life?
I don't even know if Jimmy cared if a book ever got written about his life. People like Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill laughed when we were talking about rewriting this book. Pete said, who would think guys like us would have people coming around and wanting to write books about them? Because they went to work to pay the rent, to write their novels. That's what newspaper work was originally for these guys, a way to get to write a novel. But that's my voice, and it's a voice that's informed by 37 years of working in news and writing so that people will read it. Not, a scholar. I'm not a biographer, a scholarly biographer. I wrote a popular book. That was the goal, to write a book people would want to read.
Well, I've got plenty more questions for you, but I also want to give a chance to mix in some questions from the audience. If anyone has a question for Rich here.
Those of you who knew me from the police department know this is the part where I said there are no more questions.
It's under investigation.
Did he have a nemesis? Did he have another writer that he disagreed with, or genre writer he disagreed with?
He had a nemesis for a very long time. He had a complete disdain for Rosenthal of the Times. Rosenthal firmly believed Jimmy made up these people that he wrote about. And one night Rosenthal went to Queens to see if these people really existed, and walked into a bar where all of the people who robbed the Lufthansa airline were drinking. And there was this fat guy, Fat Thomas, that he believed was Airlines, a stewardess started caressing him. And in fact, Thomas went over and said, you know, Rosenthal, she wants you in an oven. But Rosenthal thought he could write a column. And he wrote a column and Breslin read it. And he called the Times and he said, I drank with this man. This man is a disgrace to the ability, to the trade of writing columns. The grudge ended when Rosenthal got ill. And Breslin saw him leaving in a hospital in a wheelchair. When he realized they were both in the same, Breslin had brain surgery at the time. He realized they were both in the same boat. They were both going out the door, feet first. So he kind of thought maybe he should have held that grudge a little too long. So that was one nemesis. Good.
Other questions?
And
Do you see yourself in Breslin?
a little bit. I'm not that chaotic, although my daughter, Wendy, and Karen, they might all disagree. But you work with me, you know I'm not like that.
I'm talking
Yeah.
about the writing, though. Like the
It-
rhythm of your writing.
it-
I know it's
he's-
punctuation.
He has
so.
something very few writers have, which is he has a great sense of humor. And a lot of people who've tried over the years to imitate him fail because humor is a gift that most writers don't have. So I don't pretend to be able to write like something like that. And the other thing he had was his breath, where in 1989 he would write about Al Gore and tell you what Al Gore did in 1988 when he was running, and Ed Koch and he were running on a race platform in New York, and how he went from being this guy that Breslin thought was a genius, Albert Gore Jr., he's a comer, to now he's just Al Gore, and look, he brought a bit of the South to New York. That breadth of knowledge is just an amazing gift for a writer, to be able to hold that all. And part of the reason is because he could do nothing else. He couldn't drive, couldn't go to the dentist, couldn't pay his bills, he could do nothing except his work. That was all he was capable of. If you could buy him a cup of coffee, he would be his friend for life.
Hey, Rich. How are you, brother?
Jerry.
So I don't have a question. I've got more of an observation. I was a street cop back in the day when he was you had to read his column. And we knew who the columnists were in the city who loved us, and we knew who the columnists were that hated us. And we never knew how he felt about us from day to day. Like you had to read like the first two paragraphs and know where we were going, depending.
That's because you were an honest cop. Dishonest cops always thought he hated cops because he hated dishonest cops. Honest cops always wondered, do we have a shot today or not? Jerry's a good friend for many years, since 9/11 actually.
Is there like a danger of writing about someone you knew personally?
The only danger is not doing a good enough job. So you try to do the best job you can. It's like writing for your family. You want to just deliver the best job you can get. That's really the danger, is failing. But that's the danger every writer faces every day. Yeah, that's how he writes every day. So,
What about the classic story about the grave digger at Arlington? Like, got some details there?
well, the
He
details.
didn't make that up, I don't think.
He didn't make up anything. He made up everything in the service of telling the truth, but it was all based on all the facts that any of us could gather. He just knew what to do with them. So when he went to Washington for JFK's assassination and the funeral, and he wrote his editor a letter saying, I'm not going to go stand with 10,000 other reporters and cameramen and wait for a coffin to come down the street. He went to the cemetery, found Mr. Pollard, the grave digger, watched him have his breakfast, put on his overalls, go to the cemetery, dig the hole, and then not even be able to go to watch Kennedy be put in the hole until everybody else had gone, take a little bit of dirt home to have a memory of. What the grave digger wasn't just technique. The technique in telling that story is the technique of giving you everything you need to know about an assassination, about the death of a president, the death of hope, all in a very simple story. It's a short story. And in the telling of the short story, you could have read tens of thousands of words of wire copy and gotten all kinds of facts, how long the cortege was, what Jackie was wearing, where the kids stood, who was next to LBJ. And none of it would have told you what happened to America that day. And that's what he chose to do for you, and that's what you got. What was important about it was he didn't just write by himself. So he wrote that, and then there were a bunch of other people doing what people like me did for a living, which is trying to just give you the facts. So what made that writing special was the newspaper became more special. By itself, a column like that doesn't serve the reader as well as it does in the context of a whole, if that makes sense. And that's what a great voice lends to paper. His editor at the Daily News, Dick Oliver, said it was a gift to have him because he gave the paper that voice. But when he wrote about like the parking violation scandal, a woman named Barbara Ross, she did the reporting story. And the editor of the paper at the time knew Jimmy wasn't enough. I want the story by Barbara too, so that the reader has that and this. Does that help explain it a little bit?
So it's like facts and soul, and he supplied the soul.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. That's a great shirt. You should show Kevin the shirt.
Yeah, I'll show everybody. It's not for sale, so buy the book. The shirt's one off.
I don't know if this is where would you put him?
I mean, he was on your side. So where he was politically was on the side of working people, on the side of people who, like if there were a plate of cookies, like the cartoon, Donald Trump's telling you that Michael's taking your cookie, but he's got the whole plate, Michael's only got one, and you're the immigrant and saying, no, it's Michael that's taking your cookie. Jimmy would be on the side of Michael and the other person who wanted a cookie and saying, why aren't they coming from the plate from the guy that has all the cookies? So politically, he would be probably rooting for Kamala Harris right now. He would be rooting for her because she brings a fresh breath of air. She brings youth, she brings energy, she brings the first woman in this potential.
He ever write about Trump?
Oh yeah, he wrote about Trump. When the Central Park Five were accused of raping the woman in Central Park, Donald Trump waited about 5 minutes to take out a full-page ad, which to the eternal shame of every newspaper in the city, they all bought and printed a full page. The Times, the Post, the News, they all printed this, like, let's kill them. Essentially, that's what his ad said, let's kill them. And Jimmy wrote about that. And then, when these kids were exonerated, Jimmy went to court and wrote about how Donald Trump, with the hair the color of a McDonald's arch, wasn't in there the day that they got exonerated. So he wrote about him early, and he wrote about him often. He did that with Rudy, too. When Rudy did good things, like the parking violation scandal, he gave Rudy credit. Then when, in 1992, when there was the police riot, to use a word that all my friends love.
It's a strong word, Rich.
No,
Just-
but the police were sort of marching on City Hall, where David Dinkins, the first black mayor of New York, was, and Rudy was shouting and inciting a riot. That's when Jimmy said he was a small man looking for a balcony. So he was on. Generally, Mario Cuomo was his best friend, and he felt that Mario Cuomo didn't do enough, so he just wrote that. You Carey saved the city, and he thought that was great until you Carey started plucking his eyebrows and flying around in a helicopter with his new girlfriend. Then he named him Society Carey, and the Daily News used to, at the time, pictures in newspapers were airbrushed. And I used to sit in the art department and watch people take a stuffed Carey in his blue pinstripe suit, and airbrush out the stripes, airbrush off the tie, put a bow tie on it, airbrush in lapels. And now he was Society Carey in a tuxedo. That would go. If you ever saw this picture, you would say, "This is get away with this." Yeah, absolutely. So, that's the side he was on, was telling the truth and calling it as it should be seen. Myron first, if I'm going to get the difficult questions now. Phil's not allowed. Karen and Myron go then.
I have a
wrote a book, and instead of like the manuscript typewritten, one page, and in a box with a ribbon around it, he wrote it, I guess it was a word processor, and how instead of the box with the manuscript, he had a floppy disk in his pocket, his lapel pocket, and that's how he handed in the book. That sound familiar?
It doesn't sound familiar, but that doesn't mean, we read over 3,500 columns and 26 books and dozens and dozens of magazine articles, so forgive me for not remembering it, but it sounds certainly like he would walk
That's
around
the way I
like
remember
that.
it, and I still tell that story, and I still get
Well, then you're like him, you made it up, and now it's true.
Oh, I just had it. I'm going to be the person who has a comment, not a question. And my comment is,
All right, go ahead.
you're being very politic. But Phil and I are sure that Breslin would have felt extremely strongly about ex-President Trump in the negative.
Ex-President Trump.
In the negative. He would
Oh,
have
yeah.
felt
Yeah, I think
extremely
that's probably
strongly.
I think he would find him incompetent and not qualified to be president again. Thank you for that comment about Phil being the spokesperson. That's it.
Yeah, if you had to pick one scene or passage that was the most challenging to write, could be the most fun, but to reconstruct based on you loved it, you had to keep digging for the material and the facts to support it, which one would it be?
That's a really, really interesting question. So the hardest chapter of the book to write was the one about his bigotry and his ability to betray almost everyone he ever met. It is not his most charming quality, and but if you're going to write a book about someone who does a lot of great things and they have some darkness in them, you have to write about the darkness. But how do you put it in perspective, and where do you put it in the book? Initially, it was the second to last chapter in the book. But Tom felt that I was taking a scene that was pretty dark and putting it right next to a scene where someone would be memorialized, and maybe I should rethink the order of that part of the book. Jimmy was not the things he did. He did a very bigoted thing. He was not a bigot. But you had to call it as you saw it. You had to write about the bigoted thing he did. And so how do you write it is the challenge. How do you write it, tell it accurately, and make clear that that's not the whole in any way of a person. And in fact, it's an aberration. He had friends he betrayed, and they were often people who helped him for decades. And how do you explain that? And you explain it, it's a challenge. You go back to his father who betrayed his whole family when he was a toddler and walked out on them. How do you capture that? So that was the biggest challenge, was putting as many of his personalities as we could identify into the book. And he had a lot of them.
What's up?
Hey, Michael. You want to come up here? Phil can take questions
What?
now.
No, it's your book. What are you
Yeah,
looking
yeah.
at? I didn't write a book about
very
it.
critical.
What?
President, is the book that critical?
No, the book is not critical. The book is, I think, very fair, and it captures a lot of Jimmy's great qualities as a journalist and as a writer and as a person. Barbara Ross said it really well. She said he had a hard head, but he had a warm heart. And that's how we tried to put Jimmy's personality in perspective. He stole from Michael, who was one of his best friends. He snuck into his desk drawer and stole a video that only Michael had, because, as he said to Michael that day, I needed it.
Yeah, and I saw it on Nightline. Ted Koppel said only Jimmy Breslin could come up with this.
It's true, only he knew where your drawer
I only
was.
knew how to steal from David.
Michael Daly in the house.
So,
Oh, yeah.
Michael was a great help in writing this book and many other things along the way. He doesn't look that much older now.
I'm 142 years old.
But I can hear it, yeah. Hi.
Hey,
Hey, Martin.
how are you? Hey, how do you think he would have survived in the current climate, Richie?
About an hour.
Well, no, he would,
You think he would have been all right?
he took him by the daily beast, he was fascinating.
Yeah, no. He would love to work.
He never forgave the printing trades for going on strike, so there aren't any printing trades now.
No, that's true.
Why do you say an hour then? If he would have.
I thought Martin was referring to the climate in an office where in order to criticize a story, you have to tell the person how wonderful it is first. And then maybe the first paragraph that you wrote is so good that we should save it for another story. But the one at the end, it's just a suggestion on my part, but maybe if we take that last paragraph and move it up a little, that's a little hard for some people to take, you know. But Patrick didn't edit that way when he edited. Martin certainly didn't edit that way. I was a very nice and gentle editor. People were very happy when I did it.
What was the most fun chapter to write?
I tell you, one of the most beautiful chapters that made me very happy was actually his memorial service at the very end of the book, because so many people express so many beautiful feelings, and where they chose to have the memorial service in a side street, in a small church, a church that was willing to have a Jew and a Catholic in there when they got married at a time when that wasn't so common. It was a very, very special day to see everyone from Ray Kelly sitting by himself in the back, the former police commissioner, to famous book agents, to a governor, and all of them came the way he would come. They just showed up. So that was a very nice chapter.
Plus you were done there.
Was that?
Plus you were done there.
I was done. I was a little short on words, so I bought something from you, and I used that there.
You stole out of my drawer too.
Yeah, but I paid for it. But you didn't get the money.
I didn't get anything.
Ben Sherwood got it. He handed it to his pile. I said, I need another 1,000 words. Oh, here's a good 1,000 words.
No, he did a good job. Everybody, I would tell you, he did a good job.
Thank you.
And he did. He really did.
Rich, you know, you mentioned like structure before, you know, unveiling and how you choose to unveil a personality, a character is as big as Jimmy Breslin, when to do what, when, and how to order things. I feel like as for writers, it's always one of the most difficult choices of when to unveil somebody's personality. You know, you mentioned having one of the darker chapters towards the end, maybe bringing it up. Was there a lot of that same sort of thing of moving things around, or was it, not having looked at the book yet, kind of a chronological, or how did you choose what to put where? And were you going back and forth on other chapters too, of when to introduce certain things about them?
You know, I'm not that complicated, so.
Yes, you are.
I figured the way to start a book
He's not.
is start with the biggest story that I knew, and first tell you how I met him, and then say what's the story, what's the most dramatic opening you could give the book.
Right.
That was Son of Sam, and then let the book unfold chronologically. It's a formula, but as my friend Ellis Huddekin would say, that's why they have formulas. You know? And it served me very well to do it that way.
I think we won't have time to sign books at the end, but I think Ted actually had a. Oh, okay.
I've
He's not-
introduced
He can
that.
follow me.
All right.
Filling space, don't worry about it. What would you be
So what are you gonna write tomorrow? Let's see what he said. He'd think it was okay, I think.
Yeah, he wouldn't tell you that.
No, he'd think. He would tell Oliver, he'd tell one of his friends maybe.
Tell
you
that
know.
fucking Richie Esposito.
They're a funny group of people. And Dick Oliver was Jimmy's editor. When I got the same job 20 years later, he came in to shake my hand. He said, I always knew you'd have this job as Metropolitan editor. And I called Ed Burns, a sergeant in the police, and said, Oliver never talked to me in all the years I worked here. He said he likes me. He goes, yeah, that's not our way. He loves you. He thought you were great. Okay, glad the fumes. Listen, thank you guys for letting me talk a little bit about it. And mostly you're going to find yourself.